Hey everyone, what's going on? It's Am I Missing Something? It's Matt.
And it's Zakk.
This episode brought to you by Lucky 13 Beard Co. Stay tuned. Throughout the episode, we're going to have a code to get you 10% off of everything beard balm and oil related, including our new Lemmy Beard Oil with them. More on that later on. But this episode, quite a different episode than we normally do. We do these every once in a while, and we really just sit down and ask ourselves a particular topic. Are we missing something about it? Maybe it's some band fandom, maybe like, Radiohead. We've done one of them in the past, and still probably one of our biggest episodes to date, and people still are angry at it, but you got to listen to it to really understand. However, we are not here to ridicule anybody. We're not here to alienate anybody. Pretty much just an open forum conversation about something we may or may not be, missing out on.
Well, truth be told, also, we always joke we are snobs and music know-it-alls, but once in a while, we do just go, what am I missing? Like, genuinely, what am I missing? And in this instance, it was actually inspired by some recent news that came out that's kind of still shocked the metal world. As of when we recorded this, by the time you listen to this, it might have already been formally announced. You might have already even seen it live. But as of this recording, it's still not exactly clear what Pantera in 2022, 2023 is going to look like. But it was basically revealed that Rex Brown and Phil Anselmo had gotten permission to basically reform Pantera, or it's not clear if it's going to be called Pantera or something else. But basically, they will be going out on the road with Zakk Wylde and Charlie Benante performing songs by Pantera. In fact, as of now, Charlie and Zakk Wylde have basically confirmed their involvement. But again, it's still not exactly clear what it's being called. It's kind of being billed, though, as Pantera Reuniting. And anyone who is a Pantera fan, and if you've listened to our past episode of You Have to Pick Three, where we name Pantera's best songs, we are big Pantera fans. It might feel a little odd to say that, given that, let's call the elephant out in the room here. Dimebag Darrell was murdered almost 15 years ago, a little more than that. And Vinnie Paul has passed away, unfortunately, a few years ago as well. While there's been a lot of mixed reaction, a lot of fans are excited for the idea of seeing Pantera in 2022, 2023. I was feeling weird. I don't want to speak on behalf of you, Matt, and I'm sure that's where we're going to go down here, but I was having mixed reactions.
I just can't believe they pulled the trigger on it.
Well, that's true.
I said it for a while now. There was no way that there was not going to be something ever. The band members were at odds. Let's just say Phil Anselmo and Dime and Vinnie, they, weren't exactly on the best of terms when everybody was still alive. I always had a feeling that something was going to happen, whether or not Zakk Wylde was going to lead the project, because him and Dime were best of friends, and the song In This River is dedicated forever to Dime. It never leaves Black Label Society's playlist for the evening. And I thought, he was going to do kind of maybe something similar to Zach Sabbath. Maybe if he could get the rights to be able to do something in memory. But this just kind of came out of left field that they pulled the trigger on not only Phil and Rex doing this, but having it be called Pantera.
Potentially. It seems like it's going to be that. Or even just the fact that to your point, I always assumed, there's been at least once a year the Dime Bash, where it's been a tribute of a bunch of musicians coming together, jamming on Pantera songs. Dave Grohl's been involved in it. Even Phil has been involved in it at some points, of Rex Brown. I figured, all right, there'd be probably some sort of touring version of that. Maybe there'd be a rotating lineup, like a Hendrix kind of style, like when a bunch of guitarists join on the road and just jam out on Hendrix songs. Pretty much when in 2019, I think, when he announced plans to basically tour doing a Pantera set, solely a Pantera set with a solo band. It's like, all right, the timing here is pretty interesting. You waited until Vinnie Paul passed away, and here you are now performing a whole set of Pantera songs. Yeah, of course you're itching to play these songs again. But to have it be just four guys basically being Pantera definitely was a little like, I just couldn't. To your point too, it seemed like a no-brainer that Zakk Wylde would be involved.
Said it for years. I've said it for years.
And also, I even remember, I'm thinking this is like 12 plus years when I first started off at my first internship with a music marketing company, I remember someone who worked there saying, because we were, I forget even how it even came up, but they were even saying that you'd be surprised at how close a Pantera reunion has come. But it fell through for whatever reason. I imagine Vinnie Paul probably played a big reason in it. But my initial thought was just, I don't know how I feel about it. Then I also, and this is kind of what inspired the topic of this episode, why do I feel so weird about it when, not to go too down, jump too far ahead, but Alice in Chains. They basically flat out just reformed Alice in Chains. It started off as a celebrate. They saying that they wanted to celebrate the legacy, but they went ahead, got a new singer who's amazing, and ended up releasing albums that were amazing. That
Yep.
I mean, we both named Rainier Fog the best album of 2018, essentially. Why is it okay for that to happen? Or even Guns N' Roses. Why is it okay for Axl to reunite with just Slash and Duff McKagan and then forget essentially some key other members? Like, why is it okay for that? And why then am I having such a hard time with Pantera? And I have a reason, I think, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, Matt.
So let's address the bands reuniting first. So any band and any reunion that you have could essentially be either a success or a flop. And there are some bands that have this almost holy grail feel to them. Like you needed to see them with all the members to really appreciate it. Otherwise, it's going to be garbage. And Pantera is one of those bands. Another band that I can think of is Soundgarden. Replacing Chris Cornell is almost nearly impossible. Granted, Alice in Chains replaced Lane Staley with William Duvall, and it sounded great. But, there are still those purists out there that say, no, if you never saw Alice in Chains with Lane, then you're not, you didn't see Alice in Chains. I beg to differ because I never did, and I saw him with William Duvall, and he did an amazing job, and they sounded great. But, there's bands like that. And then there's also bands that are on the other side of the coin that it's like absolute, garbage fire because of the circumstances or the band members still don't get along. Like, there was a time when Pink Floyd, they got back together. I think it was like 2005 and they only had like a 20-minute set, but there was a big fight between David Gilmour and Roger Waters over the set list, and it just drove them further and further apart. I mean, think about when Van Halen reunited with Sammy Hagar in, like, what was it, 2004?
Mm-hmm. I saw them play twice on that tour too.
And
And actually, funny fact about that tour. So I saw them at the beginning of that tour in Philadelphia, and it was great. And then it was at the end of that tour, like the second leg where they were playing in Atlantic City. And you could definitely tell, it was still a blast, but you can definitely tell that they were tired, that they were like getting sick of each other. So to your
Yep.
point that like sometimes there's a reason why they broke up.
Right, exactly. There's definitely reasons that bands should or should not reunite. And then there was, the time that the Jackson 5 got back together as the Jackson 4 after Michael Jackson died. And they went out on, a tour and they didn't do anywhere near what Michael Jackson did. Like they were playing, I think, like wineries, and they were playing like small little venues, and they were even doing a set, that was all Michael Jackson single songs. So why do some bands need to get back together? I don't know why. Sometimes they don't.
There's, I think, one key reason.
Well, money, obviously.
It's a fact, as Pink Floyd would say. I mean, that's, I think, 9 out of 10 times a huge motivation.
Right.
And then there is some instances where, ego gets the best of them and like, you know what, we do want to play our song. Like we're selfish for not playing together. Or like I almost think, kind of going back to System of a Down, where I don't necessarily think they reunited just for money's standpoint. It was even more so because I feel like it was around 2010, 2011 when they finally kind of came back together after their hiatus, which was basically a breakup. And I feel like they went from in 2005, 2006 having some of the biggest albums in rock to in 2010 when all the music publications were doing the recaps of the biggest albums of the past decade. And they probably maybe got mentioned once on certain lists and far down.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a feeling it was like their ego's going, What the hell? What do you mean no one remembers how big Mesmerize was? Why is Toxicity the only one? Why is that at the very bottom of the list? Screw it. Let's remind them of how big we are. And you could almost argue that it's kind of, we've talked about this when we reviewed the 2 surprise singles they did released in 2020, how it kind of reaffirmed that like, they're really just a reunited band playing gigs here and there, because it's a shame. That was a band that had such a drive and a purpose that the time apart ended up kind of making it like a sure thing. Like, I mean, John Doyman keeps saying, no, we're being stupid for not releasing new music. It's like, no, it's the proof is in the pudding. It's true. Like, you can tell that like, no, they should just play some shows here and there. There's no need for them to do more than that,
Hmm.
sadly.
Just going back to earlier, what I was saying, there's also bands that they definitely shouldn't have tried what they tried. I mean, the Prophets of Rage. That's a
Oh God.
that's a prime example of how you don't do what Pantera is trying to do.
Well, that was just literally them wanting to reunite with Zakk De La Rocha. They thinking the timing was right for during the elections, and Zakk going, nah, I'm not interested. And they thought, well, fine, we'll just do something else with Chuck D. I still tell people how we got to see them play PNC Bank Arts Center in 2016, and it was empty. We paid only
Yep.
$20 for seats, and apparently we overpaid because the few people that were there got free tickets just because they bought tickets for another show. Like,
Yep.
it was like, and it was, I've never seen that venue, which is a huge amphitheater for those who are not from Jersey. Huge amphitheater. And it was just like empty. It was a fun show, but depressingly empty.
If I have to put a big cap on this, there's ways to do uniting a band together with all the original members, both right and wrong. And then there's a way to do a quote reunion of a band with not all of their members right and wrong. And I think Pantera is trending on the side of being done the right way. I mean, granted, we haven't heard anything yet, and we don't know if it's going to be called Pantera, but the fact that they're bringing Zakk Wylde in, probably one of Dime's best friends in the entire world, and how much Dime meant to Zakk, he's going to do this as much justice as he can. It's not, for him, I don't see it being necessarily a cash grab. I think it's more along the lines of him doing it to honor his friend.
So it's funny you say doing it the right way, because I'm actually feeling like it might be toward the wrong way simply by it happening. And here's why. In fact, actually, just recently, as we were recording this episode, Anselmo, an interview that Anselmo did back in February, it kind of came to light, and he was saying how, the Abbott brothers would want the legacy of Pantera to continue, and that kind of ticked me off because, for those familiar with Pantera history, the reason why Pantera stopped existing wasn't necessarily because, I mean, yes, they, Dimebag's death basically put I hate saying this, but a nail in the coffin of Pantera for a long time, or at least we thought. But in 2000, before Dimebag's just terrible murder, the reason why Pantera broke up was because Anselmo discommunicated himself from Dimebag and Vinnie. He trashed them into interviews, and he just basically shut all kind of communications with them. Vinnie and Dimebag never wanted Pantera to end. Dimebag has even said in interviews as he was promoting Damage Plan that if it was up to him, Pantera would be the Rolling Stones, always going on and on and on. And yeah, the arguments could be that, if Dimebag didn't get murdered, they would have reunited eventually. Maybe they would have reconciled. But the fact of the matter is that pretty much once Dimebag was murdered, Vinnie Paul held a grudge for many years. And I mentioned earlier how I've heard rumblings that reunions among the 3 original members, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't even say original because it's not really original, but the 3 key members of Pantera's legacy came really close to reuniting. But clearly, if they were going to reunite, they would have done it already before Vinnie Paul passed away. Unless if it comes out that literally they were like a month away from announcing something before Vinnie Paul passed away, I have to believe that if Vinnie Paul really wanted Pantera to continue on without Dimebag, he would have made it happen. And sure, they say that both Dimebag and Vinnie's estates have signed off on this, that they're happy to be a part of it. But, and granted, we don't really know what they've signed off on so far. There's been instances where I'm thinking back to The Doors in 2002 when Ray and Robbie reformed The Doors as The Doors of the 21st Century with Stewart from The Police on drums and Ian from The Cult singing. They, dubbed it as The Doors of the 21st Century. But then, initially, apparently they had the estates on board with Jim Morrison and even John, the drummer. But then it wasn't until that the estates saw the band perform on the Tonight Show, Jay Leno, were like, wait, why are they called The Doors? What? And they had to change their name midway through the tour. Who knows what the estates have actually agreed on? And who knows that just because the estates have signed off on it, if Vinnie would have actually signed off on it himself. I just have a hard time believing that this is what Dimebag and Vinnie would have wanted. If anything, it's even a little bit more insulting because you could argue that this could have happened with them if it wasn't for Anselmo. It was Anselmo who was basically preventing the legacy of Pantera from continuing on. So in that way, it's that's what makes me kind of irk about this specific reunion. But to your point, regarding broader unions, it really does, I guess, depend on the band.
It really does. And I mean, we don't know, and it's a lot of speculation. Like you said, what the estates signed off on. But to even get to a point with Phil Anselmo to say that, you know what, we're okay with this and we're going to sign off on it. Granted, money may be a very big thing, and maybe the estates are looking out for themselves money wise, and if they can make it, some money off of Phil doing the tour and just kind of being hands off on it, or even if they're going to sign off on the Pantera banner being on this thing, maybe I think us as music fans were going to make a bigger deal about it than it actually is, because we want it to be done a specific way, and they're just we want the music to be out there. We want it to be done in a specific way. And, maybe if, I'm going to say this because I know how big, Zakk and Dime were together. Maybe if Zakk Wylde didn't sign on and they just got some other random guitarist, kind of like what happened with Black Sabbath and Bill Ward. He wasn't the drummer on the Black Sabbath tour when they got back together with Ozzy. Maybe because the right pieces are in place, they signed off on it because they're going to make it as authentic as possible. And yeah, I can see that, the fans, and obviously you were kind of ticked off about it, that it never happened when everybody was still alive. But, we're all 10 years older at this point, and maybe grudges are just falling by the wayside at this point, or people are coming down off of, alcoholism or, drug use. And we don't know what that looks like, on a personal level for some of these people. So maybe people are thinking clearer at this point, or maybe that they're realizing, shit, I missed out, or we missed out on something that could have really happened, and they're living with regret. And this is maybe a way to get through the regret. There a lot has happened in the last 2 years.
Well, I would argue that explanation would be more plausible for any other band. I think Anselmo has made it very clear, like I mentioned before, when he went on tour with Phil Anselmo and the Illegals, when they opened up for Slayer, and it was literally just a set of Pantera songs, and there was only maybe less than a year after Vinnie Paul passed away, his actions made it very clear that he's been wanting to do a Pantera tour for a long time, but clearly had to wait until either Vinnie gave his love and blessing or passed away. Sadly, the latter happened. I mean, so I guess that's where I'm still a little irked. But then I also acknowledge that, and kind of goes back to the original question, am I being a hypocrite for thinking that, when I am perfectly okay with bands reforming after the death of an original key member, or even bands reforming without a key member who's still alive and maybe even willing to go? Like you named Black Sabbath as an example. Was it a bummer that Bill Ward wasn't a part of it? Yeah. Was I completely oh, I don't support this? No, I was still on board. And I think Tommy Cliff Edwards, who was from Ozzy's band, did a great job on tour. I think Brad Wilk did a great job on the album itself, as flawed as it might be, Black Sabbath 13. And I wasn't as sad, or I didn't feel Bill Ward was missed as much. Am I a hypocrite for thinking that? And yet here I am going, oh, I don't know about Pantera without Dimebag and Vinnie.
Because they're two key figureheads. Like, think of every band's figurehead, right? Like, who do you think of when you think of certain bands? Pantera, you think of Dime and Vinnie and Phil. You know, Rex is there, but you know, he's
sorry, Rex.
Yeah, sorry. But I mean, he's like in the background compared to the rest of the guys.
Yeah.
You know, when you think of Black Sabbath, who do you think of? Tony Iommi and Ozzy or Dio. You know, there's not really much from the other guys. You know, Geezer Butler, he's there and he's done his own thing for a while. Bill Ward, I think Bill Ward was more vocal about not being a part of the Sabbath reunion than when he was in Sabbath.
Yeah, that's true.
There's so many other bands that, you know, the big pieces when you talked about Guns N' Roses, the big pieces there are, can Axl and Slash, you know, live with each other on this tour without killing each other?
Well, I was about to say that's a great example of, also to your point too, of, you know, when you think of the key members, who would you really die to see
right
on stage? You saw me. We went to see Guns N' Roses on the Not This Lifetime tour. To that actually, oh, wow, 6 years ago, basically, at MetLife, and you saw me basically crying like a schoolgirl while they were playing Sweet Child of Mine, and freaking out every time that Slash and Axl even just walked by each other.
Yep.
Because to your point, like, yeah, would have been great to see Izzy and Steve Adler on stage there. Yeah, but the fact that Slash and Axl even willing to talk about each other in a nice way
and embracing each other at the end of the show,
like, it's still like amazing. The fact that they're still doing it, like, say what you will, but I mean, yeah, money talks for sure, and I'm sure they're getting a ton of money, but like, at this point they could have been like, you know what, we made enough money. I really don't like it. Goes to your point, like Eddie Van Halen and Sammy Hagar clearly like, you know what, not enough money for this crap, goodbye. And kind of going back to, it's funny, like going back to doing it right and doing it wrong. I'm curious what you think in regards to, and maybe I'm the only one who thinks this, Guns N' Roses, I think, have been doing it right, at least with the three of them. Whereas going off Van Halen, I don't know if I felt it was right that they reunited with David Lee Roth, but not Michael Anthony.
Well, okay, so there still might be some bad blood there with Michael Anthony, but I think Van Halen, and this is another way that this could go very wrong. I think it was done in the right spirit. However, the results, depending on when you caught the tour with David Lee Roth, it was either decent or why is David Lee Roth still performing because he's way off key?
That's true too.
So, I mean, sometimes it goes right for these bands like Guns N' Roses, and for Van Halen, it was just like, all right, it's good. You know, it's great to see Eddie up there performing Van Halen songs and jumping around, and you know, just watching him play guitar was mesmerizing. And I saw them twice on that tour, so I got both flavors of that tour, and it was amazing just to see him performing. And David Lee Roth, take him or leave him, you know, but if there's still, you know, I guess bad blood. I don't know that much about the Michael Anthony saga in there, but Wolfgang did a great job, and you know, we see what he's doing today as a musician. And I think while it would have been great to see Michael Anthony in there, really the big piece of that reunion was David Lee Roth is coming back for the first time in a long time. And I think, to the point with Guns N' Roses, I think they're doing it even better than anybody else because, you know, they filter in Matt Sorum and Izzy from, I think, on like one or two shows they came in.
Steven Adler.
Matt
Sorum hasn't done it yet.
Okay. But he came in and he did, you know, like a show or a song or something. I know that he's been
No,
there.
so
but he's
Izzy,
not.
actually to correct you, sorry to correct you, but Steven Adler has done 1 or 2 shows. Izzy has not. So Izzy actually, I was very fortunate back during, it was even before Chinese Democracy came out. Axl Rose and the New Guns N' Roses did a 4-night stint in the Hammerstein Ballroom. I was actually Bumblefoot's first gigs with the band. And I got to catch the final night, and Izzy Stradlin came out and did Thinking About You with Axl Rose in the band. So he's performed with Axl. He's performed, I think he even did a few songs with Velvet Revolver at some concerts in the past. In fact, he was even like attached to Velvet Revolver in the early days before he kind of like was like, I don't know about this anymore. But and there was a report that Izzy showed up for a sound check and then immediately was like, nope, and left. So apparently that was close. And even he's been kind of vocal about how, like, yeah, it's bullshit that they only wanted to pay me as like a guest instead of an actual member of the group. So you can make the argument that it wasn't, even like Steven Adler's like lack of a role has been kind of criticized. It made me think of it. So another band that's kind of gone through a similar thing where they reunited some big members, but not the whole lineup, Smashing Pumpkins. And it kind of got revealed through like a lot of back and forth ugliness that Darcy, the bassist, wanted to join the band, but basically was not really invited. And at most, Billy Corgan was like, well, you can come and play a song or two on select tour dates. And the leaked text messages from Billy, he was like, listen, look at what Guns N' Roses is doing with Steven Adler. He just comes out for a song and fans love it. And immediately, like whenever all the critics are like, well, actually, no, fans have had an issue with that too. Now, I mean, would we end up kind of going, maybe Steven Adler shouldn't play a whole set once he doesn't play a whole set? Maybe, but it definitely would have been received better. He wouldn't have not been received poorly if Steven Adler played a whole tour. Sure, nice that he did a song, but like there's definitely some fans who are like, come on, why just one song?
Right. So they could only screw it up. It wouldn't have necessarily made it that much better because the band sounds great the way it is now.
That's true.
And
Although
you could
I'm
make
not a huge fan of the current drummer, Frank. No offense. Sorry, Frank, but there was sometimes I'm like, you messed up that part. It was kind of more noticeable. That's just me being nitpicky. I still had a great time. Don't get me wrong.
Right, but the band sounds great the way it is now. If the band sounded lackluster with these new members, then I think people would be clamoring more about it than what they are now. But going back to this Pantera thing that's happening, I mean, I think time's gonna tell when, is this the right way to go? I mean, the first night is going to be the biggest tell.
Whether or not this, you got Charlie Benante on drums, who's like one of the best and most underappreciated metal drummers of all time, too. I mean,
absolutely.
Like, and basically the two, him and Zakk, have confirmed that they're involved. So we know they're involved in some way. Yeah, to your point, they're getting the right musicians involved. And it's almost to the point that it's almost like seems too good to be true.
I don't know if it's too good to be true. Like I said, I've been saying if Pantera was ever going to get back together and they needed a guitarist, there's no other person in my mind other than Zakk Wylde to do it. And the fact that he signed on, okay, that just confirms everything I've been saying. The drummer role for me could have been filled by a lot of different people, but I think Charlie just seems like he could be just a natural fit too.
Let me ask you a question. So you kind of talked about this a little bit when you brought up Guns N' Roses again. In your opinion, what was, it doesn't have to be a reunion show that you actually saw, but what was in your mind a reunion that was executed perfectly?
I keep going back to Alice in Chains.
That's high up for me.
I mean, there's really never been a complaint. The only complaining that really happened was prior to the first album of them getting back together, Black Gives Way to Blue. And William Duvall kind of just shut everybody up. And another thing about that reunion in particular is you got to remember that Alice in Chains is a dual vocal band. Jerry Cantrell is an amazing vocalist as well.
Yeah, he never
So
got enough credit for his vocals.
he, on top of William Duvall, there was maybe, I'd say maybe you're missing a little bit of what Lane, added to the flavor that wasn't there. But William did his own thing and made it his own, and seeing it live, I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find anybody else who did it better. Now, I'll say this on the other side of, if you're looking for almost, I say, reunion level performances out of a non reunited band, I would say Miles Kennedy doing Guns N' Roses when Axl wasn't in the picture and he was touring with Slash and the Conspirators. So that, I think, is another great melding of, if you want to see, great performances, because once again, what are you looking for? You're looking for a key vocal performance and Slash's guitar solos, and then just solid backing. And the Conspirators did that. Slash obviously is doing Slash things, and Miles, I thought he could have, if Axl didn't do Guns N' Roses, Miles could have stepped in and did a whole Guns N' Roses tour.
I would say with Alice in Chains, they were proof of converting naysayers, shutting anyone who had any doubts down, proving that, anyone who might have been like, I'm not sure, converting them and be like, yeah, this is great.
Yep.
I think the reunion, though, in my mind, that I think excelled at doing it right, hitting all the right notes. Maybe it didn't last so long, but at the time it was near perfection of how they executed the reunion. I'm going to go with Kiss in 1996.
See, I'm not a big Kiss fan, so I can't.
Regardless of whether or not you're a big Kiss fan, I'm thinking even more so from a marketing and PR standpoint.
Well,
they
Kiss.
did that. Well, then that is Kiss. But to me, if you want to look at how do you roll out a reunion perfectly, I mean, you got to also remember at the time, it had been years since since fans not only saw Kiss with Peter Criss and Ace Frehley, but had been years since they had even seen Kiss in makeup. I mean, they were just so used to a whole decade of Kiss basically being a glam rock band. And I think the band knew the timing was right in that you had a lot of these heavy grunge or even hard rock bands who you'd think, they're way too dark and heavy to cite a band from the 70s and influence, going, actually, you know what? I grew up listening to I Want to Rock and Roll All Night. That's the album that made me pick up a guitar. And they just kind of capitalized on the moment of rock is kind of hip right now. And here's a lot of young bands citing the 70s era of Kiss as their influence. Let's give these fans what they want. Let's get Ace, let's get Peter, let's get the makeup on, and let's give the explosive Kiss show that they were used to in the 70s and blow them out of the park. I mean, you hear stories of a bunch of musicians like Sebastian Bach and just Scott Ian talk about how they were crying at the sight of seeing their childhood heroes back on stage. I mean, from a nostalgia point, they just did it right. I mean, even the way that they kind of surprised everyone at the Grammys when Tupac Shakur was, about to announce the winners of an award. I forgot what the award was. It was like, let's do something exciting. And suddenly, out of nowhere, the members of Kiss showed up in makeup with Tupac. I mean, that sight alone is really funny. But like the way that they revealed it, the way that like they executed it, I mean, it ended up becoming one of the most successful tours, and it really kind of repopularized Kiss. And even to the point of, I mean, that in a similar way, kind of, you mentioned about Pink Floyd's reunion at Live Aid in 2005. I would actually argue that was a success because it ended up getting David Gilmour and Roger Waters to talk again, even if their relationship continues to be a little rocky. I mean, they kind of end up, they're cordial now, which you couldn't say about Pink Floyd before that. And that 20-minute set basically reminded a whole new generation of fans of how great Pink Floyd was. So in a way, sure, it was the only thing that came out of that reunion was a 20-minute set with Roger Waters. That alone did enough to repopularize Pink Floyd, to the point that it used to be Led Zeppelin was the number one choice for bands who you wanted to reunite, to the conversation changed to Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin. So I think from a different standpoint of Kiss, that 20-minute reunion did more for Pink Floyd than a whole tour could have done for most bands. And then, so in a similar way of reunions that failed. So you know how I talked about like Kiss surprising everyone at the Grammys? Well, they delivered on the reunion at least. I think back, we talked about Van Halen and the many ugly splits that they had, but I don't think any split was uglier than when Van Halen decided, yeah, let's reunite with David Lee Roth to present an award at the VMAs, only to break up or cancel the reunion 2 days later because Eddie got pissed off at David Lee Roth. Like, if you're going to reunite, at least double check that you can actually stand each other before you hit the stage. So I think that's an example of like a reunion just done poorly. And I still think the way that I think them not including Michael Anthony dampered them finally getting back together with David Lee Roth. So in a similar vein, Matt, which reunion would you say was done so poorly that you wish it didn't even happen?
I mean, I think the Prophets of Rage thing, that's pretty awful. That was...
So that leads to another question, though.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a reunion, or is that trying to package something different? Like, because I was also in the back of Pantera. Would it be better if Pantera called themselves something different as opposed to just calling it Pantera?
So the Prophets of Rage essentially was, tell me if you've heard this one before. Rage Against the Machine gets together with a new vocalist.
Well, it was.
What does that sound familiar to? And let's go down this road. They can do it. They've done it before. It's called Audio Slave. Now, they did it with Prophets of Rage, which was, I think, just a blatant cash grab from guys who are saying, screw the system, rise up against the system, but we're going to use the system to make a pretty penny, aka off of Live Nation. So I think that, with Zakk backing out and not wanting to do it, they needed the money. They went out and did it with Chuck D and
Be Real from Cypress Hill. Let's give
Be Real from Cypress Hill. And I think you can hear that they were trying to be like tough and angsty, and looking at the crowd, there was nobody who was, angsty about that, and nobody really felt that it was real. Now, this Rage Against the Machine tour that's going on now, if the band members can stay on the stage, I think it has a chance.
And not just get kicked off the stage by security by accident.
Well, not only that, didn't Zakk fall and break something, and Zakk he had to sit?
Fell and broke something, and he's basically sitting while the tour is going on. Well, going back to Prophets of Rage, before I ask another follow-up question that I'm still torn about, if Prophets of Rage had done a studio album first, then toured, or even a studio, or even just because they initially started to just do like maybe 3 or 4 small club shows, but then immediately did a whole amphitheater tour. Like, they overbooked. They overestimated how much of demand there was, and they booked way too big venues. Would it have been better, though, if Prophets of Rage came out first with their own new music, as opposed to touring and then a year later basically do a new album?
I think so.
Or was it doomed to begin with from the start?
See, I think if they did the album first, they would have kind of garnered a reaction from people, and they could have put in a cover of Killing in the Name or another, Rage song to see if people would react to it a certain way. Like, if they released it as a cover to radio and seeing how well it did, then maybe, all right, we can go out and do a full stadium deal.
I mean, part of me wants to agree with you, but going to your point about how it was such an obvious cash grab, I mean, if you look at the cover of the album that they eventually did release, if you didn't know how to read and you only could tell from just logo fonts and like
just
an artwork,
Rage,
it just was like, no, this is Rage Against the Machine, just with different letters.
Correct.
Like, it almost seemed a little too obvious that, and again, it goes to how clear your motives are. It's just obvious that Zakk said no. And you're like, well, Live Nation's already offered us an amazing deal. Thankfully, they said, okay, as long as you get Chuck D to do it, go for it. And
just looking at the artwork of these albums, so you can see that in 2016 and 2017, they released a single, then they released the album, and then it's kind of cohesive. Going into 2018, I've seen indie bands or independent bands with better artwork than they put for the single for Hearts of Fire. It looks like somebody just slapped together a whole bunch of clip art.
So going off of the continuing theme of names, do you think there's a sense of credibility when a band who is replacing a deceased member goes, yes, it's still this band, but we're adding this name to it to kind of make it clear that we're not trying to replace anyone? And I'm thinking of examples of Queen with Adam Lambert or Sublime of Rome. Does that justify that project's existence, or does that still to you signify a cash grab?
I don't think it signifies a cash grab. I think they did it. I think Queen with Adam Lambert did it correctly. Now, I'm trying to remember if Queen with Roger Daltrey,
Paul Rogers.
not Paul Rogers, excuse me. I always mix those two guys up. I don't remember if they changed the name of the band at that point.
Yeah, so I actually got to see. I saw that live.
I'm sorry.
With Paul Rogers. No, it was a fun show.
Any show's fun.
In hindsight, he was not the right. They should have just did a different kind of super group, because while they tried to chalk it up of, oh, Paul was one of Freddie's favorite singers, it's like, yeah, but that's not the same. That should have been a. But I saw that live, and they always went by Queen with Paul Rogers.
They did.
And they did release a studio album.
They did, which was awful.
That probably, yeah, it really was. That one they probably could have benefited from just calling it a different group. Still just flat out singing Queen songs. And actually, when they did Bad Company songs, it still sounded pretty cool.
Well, because and that's another point that I always like to make, is that the hardest member of the band to replace is the lead singer, because it is going to vastly change your sound, because you can buy all of the amps and guitars and make you sound like Brian May or like Slash, and you can get very, very close to that sound, and you can have somebody who's very talented play it, and it'll sound almost like the band. But I mean, vocals is a very specific thing.
With that said, Adam Lambert definitely. I haven't gotten a chance to see them live yet, but everything I've seen clip wise, it's like, all right, he comes close, and he does it. He does a good, like, he knows where the line is.
Correct.
Like, he's just close enough to be like, listen, you paid to see Queen. I'm going to give you a Queen show, but without it being too campy or too blatant of, all right, this is me acting like Freddie Mercury. Granted, I mean, you can argue that that's the role that he was born. Just like how Zakk Wylde was like, no, that's the perfect choice to have fill in for Dimebag. You could argue the second that Adam Lambert sang Bohemian Rhapsody on American Idol, it's like, no, there was no other guy that Queen should be touring with other than him.
Yeah, and they were always back and forth at that point in time. The guys were in Queen, their management, had this thing going on with Adam Lambert, saying, hey, keep your eye on this guy, keep your eye on this guy. And then all of a sudden it just happened. And the documentary that's on Netflix now, I think it's still on there, about how that whole thing kind of came together. It's very interesting to watch that relationship together and to see, Adam Lambert just step into that role kind of naturally and not really have to be forced to be like Freddie, but being himself was almost kind of being Freddie. It's very interesting to watch that. So that, I think, is the right way to handle something like that. Sublime with Rome, I mean, they sound like a different band at this point. I mean, I saw them and I didn't think I was going to be bored seeing Sublime live, but I was.
Well, and it's funny because, I mean, I was just about to bring this up too. Here's an example of how you have a former member, Bud, who was the original drummer, initially part of the project. Even he was like, yeah, we shouldn't be doing this. And he backed out. And now it's literally just Eric, who's the sole original member of Sublime. And I remember when they first got sued by Bradley's estate for being called just Sublime. It's like, well, that's not fair. Eric and Bud have every right to play that music too.
Yep.
But then it does make you go like, all right, to what point though should the name continue when it's down to just one member? I mean, you can then make the argument that that's Black Sabbath. That's what ended up dooming them for so long. And it's funny, like I think it was right before they reunited again in 2011. There was the lawsuit between Ozzy and Sabbath for, demanding more percentage of the band rights that I think he ultimately won. I forget if he won or not, but everyone was like, that's bullshit. It should be 25, 25, 25, 25. And Ozzy's argument was like, listen, when you reunited with me in the 90s, your credibility boosted up again. You guys were barely able to play clubs when it was just the Tony Iommi show. I gave the band credibility. Like, it wasn't just like when they reunited with Dio, they knew not to call it Black Sabbath, not because there'll be issues with Ozzy. No, because the truth of the matter is, I love Dio with Black Sabbath, but Black Sabbath is with Ozzy. They did a great job, another successful reunion in a way during the 90s of just revigorating what Black Sabbath was. And I hate to say it, but as much as I saw Heaven and Hell live a few times, the Dio era Black Sabbath reunion essentially, and I know for a fact that as each tour went on, it started drawing less and less people. And even when they released an album that was actually The Devil like it was phenomenal, it didn't sell that way. And for an album that was essentially a Black Sabbath album that should have been a huge hit, it really wasn't. Sure, maybe for a band that with a new identity, it did fine, but if it's essentially Black Sabbath, it should have been a top 10 album, and it barely was, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes to the point of, hate to say it, but maybe Ozzy does deserve 50% Black Sabbath rights versus 25%. When you know your value.
Yeah, but I mean, think of some of these bands that are out there now that have no original members left. It is literally the record label's name to do whatever the hell they want with it. Like Gwar, they have no original members left, and they just released an album under the name Gwar. I mean,
listen to our review of Gwar's new album, 2 minutes of review on any platform you can imagine.
There's like Rat. They don't have any original members. Quiet Riot doesn't have any original members. I mean, you want to get really deep into classic rock. Humble Pie doesn't have any original members left. Iron Butterfly doesn't have any original members left. So, I mean, there's so many bands that are out there that don't have original members, and the name is just, owned by the record label. Do what you want with it. But for these other bands, and it really comes down to who holds the naming rights and what do they choose to do with it. I mean, if you can go out there and you can make some money underneath that name, I mean, why not try it? But I think if people are going to fight over the name and somebody doesn't want you to have the name, like Sublime with Rome, they don't want you to tour underneath Sublime because Bradley's not a part of it because he's, he passed on. But I think that there has to be more than half consensus, and then they should be able to do it. But,
well, I mean,
what do I know? I'm just a podcaster on the internet.
The Doors had half consensus, and they still lost. They still couldn't. Even the Doors of the 21st Century was too close of a resemblance to the original name for the estates to feel comfortable with them touring.
And that's something that I think it's just on a case by case basis. You really can't put everything underneath one bubble. That everybody should agree to this rule. I mean, I think it should be if more than half of the naming rights are with the people who want to tour and they want to tour underneath that name, too bad, so sad. It's our name too. It's not just yours. Because you could be dealing with children or grandchildren of the original members at this point. So, there's not much that you can do there. Let them tour with the name. Get some royalties out of it. Why not? If people are going to pay to see it, let them pay to see it.
So to wrap up this conversation, I think we've kind of summarized that it's a case by case, band by band instance. But do you agree, listeners? Are Matt and I completely off base? Do we not know what we're talking about? Are there bands that you wish you could see reunite? Are there bands that you wish never did reunite because it tainted your thought or your original thought of what the band was like? Let us know on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, at Epic Footnote. Also subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more episodes like this. And thank you so much to Lucky 13 Beard Co.
We partnered with Lucky 13 Beard Co. and they deliver some great beard balms and oils, definitely leaving you feeling the best that you can. Your beard is never going to feel better or smell better than with their products. And we've got one of our own with them, the Lemmy Bourbon Cola Tobacco and Leather. It is everything that Lemmy from Motorhead was. And we're giving you 10% off on everything on their site. Just throw it in your cart and use the code EFP10 at checkout, and you're going to get 10% off of everything in there. Lucky 13, the number, beardco.com, 10% off your order using the code EFP10 at checkout.
Real quick before we sign off, Matt, we talked about Lemmy and our special Lemmy inspired beard oil. Can we both agree that there's no way in hell Motorhead could reunite without Lemmy?
Never say never.
Oh, hot take. Thanks so much for listening. Hope you join us for another episode real soon.
Walk on home, boy.